episode 22 of Expertise is Overrated, the podcast that takes the time to answer the questions you didn't know you didn't want the answer to. I'm Vib.
And I'm Sean, and neither of us has any clue what we're talking about. Before we move on, let's award the much vaunted Expertise is Overrated Tinfoil Award.
As a reminder, this is an award that we give at the start of each episode to the person who had the most ridiculous point in last week's episode.
So you're getting it this week, right?
No, actually. Somehow you outdid my thing, which is becoming a bit of a theme, the sort of foreshadowing / prescience.
Yeah, you're
like
a big fan of like people who are not psychic being psychic, which is excellent.
It's because I'm so smart that I foresee every eventuality that I assume that other people do as well. And there's the tinfoil for next week.
I was going to say, isn't your chess rating, while better than mine, still only about 600?
No, I think it's about 900. I don't know. I've played for a while, actually.
Yes. Anyway.
But no, it is not in fact going to me. It is going to you for saying that the Force is just magic.
It is. The Force is space magic. That's all it is. The Force is space magic, and Jedi are space wizards with swords. That's it. That is Star Wars. I've explained Star Wars to anyone who cares to listen.
See, for once, you've actually managed to explain something in the time limit that we set. But
yeah.
You've explained it wrong, I think. It's also, I remember writing down something about you saying all the magic drains out of this world. You know, it's almost like you haven't watched the films.
No, that's my... But you were saying that as well. You were talking about the power bleeds that...
We had a power bleed, not the draining of magic from the world.
It's the same thing.
It is not... Oh my goodness.
It's the same narrative purpose as the fact that the third age of Lord of the Rings is the least magical.
Well, yeah. Some would say the fourth age.
Yes, the fourth age is even less magical because the magic is draining out of the world.
What's great is we've been talking for 2 minutes. I already feel my blood pressure rising. I have a condition; it's bad, and something tells me it's only going to get worse from now on. But let me offload some of that rage as I firmly plant the tinfoil hat on your head.
Fair enough.
We move to some feedback.
Yes, we had on the Star Wars episode. In fact, we had some feedback on our Discord server. Link in the description from CT again, who had quite a lot to say, really. I won't go through all of it because you can join the Discord server and read it for yourself. But
quite right.
He didn't like that we both had Ben Kenobi versus Darth Vader in the top 5 because he's a child easily wowed by flashing lights and incapable of enjoying complex narrative and themes. He, to be fair to him, gave us the well-known story that the scene in Empire, the I Am Your Father scene, the only person on set who knew that was what was going to be said was the actor playing Darth Vader, which is a good fact.
Was it though? Wasn't it the voice actor whose name?
So that was my understanding. My understanding was actually that what is said on stage or in the scene by the actor in the suit was not "I'm your father," because that only gets said by James Earl Jones.
The problem is, but you have to say it on set though, otherwise
the
reactor's response, as in Mark Hamill's response, will not be sufficiently harrowing, I think.
But
so maybe it was the actor at the time, yeah.
and then James Earl Jones did it as well. But,
James Earl Jones, that's the one, yeah.
The big one that he brought up that he would have had as an honourable mention in his list had he been invited to make one, which he was not, would have been the... Well, I'm really starting harsh today.
Yeah, good.
It's not going to get better. It would have been the Rey versus Kylo Ren fight on Kijimi in Rise of Skywalker. It's not a massive fight, but it's fought over Force Skype, and you get more reveals about Rey's past of being a no one and Palpatine having had her parents murdered. And he reckons it's a pretty good scene, and it's not bad. I guess it's not awful.
No, don't be disingenuous.
I have
what was the reply to that particular comment?
Shame Rise of Skywalker is an unmitigatable pile of shit, really. And then that set off a bit of an argument.
Of course, this is a never-ending argument, I think.
But he where was his thing? He says he's got a strong dislike of the original trilogy and things that occur therein, so he doesn't like the dodgy lightsaber fights.
I don't understand that mentality at all.
No, nor do I. It's one that really frustrates me because the prequels and the sequels, I suppose, as well, really lean into the idea that they're like action swords and almost swords and sandals type films. Obviously not actually sandals and not actually swords, but they're that kind of like over the top sword combat being the focal point of the films. Whereas if you compare that with the original trilogy, the climax realistically of each of those films is not a fight. It's all character. The climaxes are all character moments.
Yes.
And I think that's why the original trilogy remains so good today, notwithstanding the fact that the special effects have aged really badly, is my view. And if you look at the original trilogy and you look at the fight between Ben and Vader and go, oh, that's a rubbish sword fight, you've completely missed the point, I think.
Yeah, entirely. Entirely. It's good that we agree on something today. It's probably going to be the last time.
Yeah.
But it's a strong dislike of the original trilogy and things that occur in it. I mean, that is such a strong saying.
Yes, it's a really weird way of putting it.
It's quite something. Yeah, I mean, children, I suppose. What can you say, really?
This is the problem, really. We're dealing with infants.
Yeah, I did like the term Force Skype.
Force Skype is good. I like Force Skype.
That was a decent fight. It's not very long. I think it's just because it has that gimmick, and it's not a good duel. It's just that it happens in such a weird way, I suppose.
I don't really remember it because I've only watched Rise of Skywalker once, and it hurt me on a deep level. But that's the one where they're each in different rooms, and you keep seeing the fight from the perspective of, like, you see it from like Rey's perspective, and she and Ren are both on the planet, and then you see it from Ren's perspective, and he and Rey are both on the ship. That's the one. That's the one.
Yeah, and it's almost like they're trying to emulate a sort of Bourne supremacy, Bourne ultimatum type thing, where like, oh, she's in the office all along.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly, that sort of thing. No, it's okay, but just nowhere near as good as some of the other things.
No, I don't think it's enough, really.
Can we just talk about how much is Rian Johnson paying you, by the way? Because it must be loads.
No, I do this for free. These are my genuine, personally held beliefs.
Well, if he's listening, you have one fan out there in the world. Sadly for you, he's an idiot.
We are many. We're just less loud than the wailing neckbeards that I'll be talking about later.
That sounds so unlikely. Which brings us very nicely to what we're doing today. I regret to inform you, dear listeners, that it is another hot take by Sean.
Yep.
Yay. So rather than our usual brand of rating stuff we know nothing about, in a hot take, one of us will present an unusual or unpopular way of looking at a well-known fictional situation. The other will attempt to sit quietly, usually fail to sit quietly, and let them explain their reasoning before inevitably losing their cool and the episode descending into petty name-calling.
So since my last hot take on why Aragorn's claim to the Kingdom of Gondor is nothing more than a political coup backed by First Age revanchists went down quite so well, I've picked another equally self-evident topic. So before we get started, any thoughts, any last words?
I think I might just go and play The Witcher 3 for a good 30 minutes, and then, I don't know, if you're still talking, whatever. You can edit this one and just send it.
Right.
No, I look forward to this. You're going to embarrass yourself greatly.
Here we go. The End Times, much maligned culmination of Games Workshop's Warhammer Fantasy Battles universe, was not the massive failure and disaster that the Warhammer community would have you believe it was. No, indeed it was not. Rather, it was in fact a masterful example of both narrative control and business acumen, and people who fail to recognise this are exemplifying the very worst aspect of both grognardism and, dare I say it, gatekeeping. No, far be it from me to go ranting off about something without giving you, our loyal listeners, the necessary background to be able to meaningfully agree with me. So, to that end, time for a patented expertise is overrated explanation of the end times in 15 minutes or less. Now, picture, if you will, the world late in 2014. Scotland's independence referendum had failed on the promise that that was the only way to remain a member of the European Union. Divinity Original Sin was changing the way we thought about computer-based RPGs, while on the tabletop, Wizards of the Coast had just released the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons to widespread appeal. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. No, what we're here to talk about is a small company based out of Nottingham. We're here to talk about Games Workshop. And at the end of 2014, to give some context, Games Workshop was, if not on the rocks, at least not thriving. And, sad to say, a significant factor in that struggle was one of its 2 flagship games, Warhammer Fantasy Battles. For the uninitiated, Warhammer Fantasy Battles was a tabletop fantasy war game set in a world of, more or less, Games Workshop's own creation. Players bought horrendously overpriced miniatures from Games Workshop, whether those be from the knightly Bretonia, the stoic dwarves, the noble high elves, the savage greenskins, etc. Yes, that's right, I did just etc. I'm not going through every army in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. You've got access to Google. Go do your own research, you lazy sod. Right, I'm not quite sure where that came from. Anyway, where was I? Ah, yes, the many failures of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. So, the system was bloated, immensely so. The barriers to entry were inexplicably high, the rules completely overcomplicated. General appetite for complex regiment-based combat in tabletop fantasy wargaming had fallen since the height of Warhammer Fantasy Battles in favour of narrative and squad-based games. No, to be clear, that's not to say that no one was playing Warhammer Fantasy. They were. Of course they were. That much is evident from the hordes of idiots on Reddit screaming about how Games Workshop betrayed them, came into their homes and burned their collections in the wake of the end times. But the numbers were dwindling. The point is made clear from the annual report of Games Workshop from 2014 that their growth numbers were massively underperforming. Now, just as a side note, it bears mentioning that there are actually people who, in the wake of the end times, burned their own Warhammer Fantasy collections, and I'd just like to say that I consider those people to be at the same time heroes and morons. But all of the foregoing just serves to set the stage for the end times. One of the material barriers to entry for Warhammer Fantasy was the overwhelming amount of lore that had been written around it in its 30 years. There were whole libraries worth of it built up, most of it hard to find, Drachenfels, anyone, and even more of it utterly impenetrable and ridiculous. The game had, for better or worse, become unapproachable to new players. Something needed to be done. Enter the end times, an apocalypse-scale event in a world defined by apocalypse-scale events, the war to end all wars, the epic culmination of centuries or millennia-long conflicts. The result was the destruction of the world of Warhammer Fantasy, to be replaced by the theoretically more approachable worlds of Age of Sigmar. No, this change was, as you might expect, manifestly unpopular. And yet, I contend, it was not only necessary, but good. I have 3 core reasons for saying so. 1, it was financially necessary. 2, it was narratively necessary. And 3, crucially, it was both narratively and financially successful. Now, I may have a 4th point about the mechanical necessity, but to be honest, I don't think I need that crutch to convince anyone of intelligence of the merits of my arguments. In the absence of being able to ask anyone of intelligence about what I've just said, would you like to say something stupid before I really get started?
Well, you have me at a disadvantage here. I thought we were talking about The End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World, Asteroids, Supervolcanoes, Rogue Robots, and More by Brian Walsh.
Well, one of us is going to look silly at the end of this.
No, I'm kidding. I'm writing down some notes. Not on what you're saying, because it's irrelevant, but I'm writing down notes.
That's fair. Okay, so just on my first point, and I'm going to try and keep all of these points rather brief, but on finances. Now, this may end up a little more technical than people are used to from Expertise is Overrated, so I will try and keep it brief, but believe it or not, I've actually done some actual research. Now, there's a famous statistic that I've not been able to track down, that at one point, Games Workshop made more money selling cans of Chaos Black spray paint than they did from the entire Warhammer Fantasy range. Because I haven't been able to track down that statistic, I've got no idea whether or not that's actually true. But given what I'm about to say, it feels about right to me. I've, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, checked the accounts published by Games Workshop every year. They're available on Companies House in the UK. You can check this for yourself. And I've checked the accounts for the year ending 2014, and they actually make for very interesting reading. Now, Games Workshop had annual group revenue of £123 million for the year ended, I think it's May 2014. Now, this isn't chump change by any stretch of the imagination, but that's actually not a lot of money if you're a company the size of Games Workshop. Really not a lot of money for a company with a main market London Stock Exchange listing, which Games Workshop has. Its shares were trading at about 500 pence per share, having taken something of a dip since their 2013 height of nearly 800 pence a share. That's a big dip. Now, for the uninitiated, that's what we call a company in a slump. A company in a slump like that cannot continue with a product line that's neither growing their customer base nor making them particularly large amounts of revenue. Again, I present you with the fact that, by all accounts, they were making more money from a single paint than they were from one of their two flagship brands. That is, frankly, absolutely batshit insane. I honestly have been trying, and I can't think of an equivalent. It's like McDonald's keeping the McRib going, even if they could show that it just was costing them money. No one would expect that. That's so self-evidently bad business that to even suggest it proves only that you're a millennial with precisely no concept of how to run a business or balance your checkbook. Piss off and buy an avocado. It was financially necessary that something change, and the obvious casualty, other than just laying off half your staff, which they could have done and didn't, was to rebrand and update the division that, by all accounts, was just a money sink. The End Times was the narrative method through which a necessary business decision was taken. But the finances aren't that interesting. I work with business people, it's my bread and butter, so I take one look at that and just go, yeah, that's what needed to happen. Moving on. But I'm willing to accept that that's not enough for some people. Some people need to feel loved by the companies they buy products from, and for better or worse, many people found the End Times to be, and I'm quoting from a myriad of posts on Reddit, a betrayal. No, I think this is a point that needs to be made quite carefully. To be abundantly clear, before I move on to the narrative necessity of the End Times, I really need to stress something that I fear is being missed time and time again when we talk about nerd culture. Unless you are a shareholder in Games Workshop as a company owes you precisely the square root of fuck all. They're under no obligation to provide you with whatever product you think you want. They know better than you what sells. They know better than you what the majority of their customers want, and they know better than you what's best for their products. The only obligation that Games Workshop as a company is under is to generate revenue for its shareholders. Sorry, that's just how the world works. Don't like it? Work to abolish capitalism. Gosh, sorry, I've gone off piste again.
I feel we should cheer or something here. I mean, wow. You're not a communist.
Well, I make no statement as to the merits or demerits of that being the economic model that we live under, but that is the economic model that we live under. If Games Workshop were to continue a division that was costing them money, the directors, the CEO, all of them should be fired and could possibly be taken to court with criminal sanctions. That's what we're talking about here. Companies exist to make money for their shareholders. End of story. Goodbye. See you later. But
no, I'm fully in agreement with you, and I think we should talk about this later.
Oh, yes, sorry, I've gone completely off piste again and need to get back to the betrayal that was the End Times. No, this is my second point, one that I've already touched upon. The narrative necessity of the End Times. Now, I don't know about you or any of our listeners, but for my sins, I've actually read a fair amount of Warhammer Fantasy lore, contained as it is in, among other things, books published by the Black Library, various Warhammer Fantasy Battles army and rule books, and the general internet nerd space, which I inhibit. And you know what? Sorry to say, a lot of it is really crap. There, I've said it. I've uttered the unforgivable words. It's a lot of it's just bad. Some of it's fine. Some of it could actually be stretched to not bad. One or two bits of it could actually be called good if you got drunk and squinted hard at it. But most of it is just not. It was also, unfortunately, massively complicated. The explanation of, for example, a topic that we've discussed before, the Sundering, takes up far more pages and ink than is really necessary for an event that, other than giving rise to the factions playable in the supposed time period of the game, has no impact on play whatsoever. Finally, the world of Warhammer Fantasy Battles was, sad to say, just too small. One of the greatest benefits of the Warhammer 40k universe, by contrast, the great competitor product that Games Workshop put out there, is that it is pissing enormous. It's just ridiculously big. It takes place over an entire galaxy, which gives you the player, the benefit of being able to say, yes, I know that normally Space Marines aren't purple and yellow with green highlighting, but these ones are, because they're from the Xerxes sector that's not explored in the published media, because I've just made it up, because I think those colours are cool, and that just works. Unfortunately, you cannot do that to the same degree with a game that is set in a more or less definitive time period on a comparatively small world. You can't just invent an 11th elector count. Their number, and thus the colour of their armies, is more or less set in stone by the published lore, and that is just restrictive. And the tabletop wargaming space being what it is, you can bet that if you turned up at a tournament with, say, an Empire army from Talabekland, but using a unit that in the lore is shunned by Talabekland, for whatever reason that might be, some neckbeard is going to come up to you and say, well, actually, and then ruin your day. And that just makes the game less attractive to new players, which means it makes less money, which means that Games Workshop don't invest in it, which just continues this cycle of failure for Warhammer Fantasy Battles as a product. That's why it needed to change. We've covered it from a financial perspective, and I've gone some way to explaining why it was a necessary step from a narrative perspective, but I think we can probably come back to that if you want. But what we need to do now, I think, is step into the lore of the end times itself and talk about the various things that happened in the lore to bring about a cataclysm so big it deleted an entire product range. Now, I've been talking for a while, so I thought it might be interesting for you, Vib, to have a pop at explaining what you think happened during the end times, because you're not as deep in the lore as I am, but you've probably come across a fair bit in the internet space about people complaining about it.
Shall I keep my scathing version of this out for now? Because
yeah, I think let's go factual. Let's go factual
okay.
things.
I'll pretend that you've not said anything so far, so I don't feel quite so angry. What happens in the end times? Well, see, this is really tough, isn't it? Because I equally collected Warhammer Fantasy, not hugely, but I collected some of it. I owned the rulebook at one point, and I had, I think maybe just the one codex, maybe two. I can't remember now. It was a long time ago. Is the problem? And now I do obviously know that Age of Sigmar is a thing, and I know how they're linked.
Sure.
So my guess is obviously, as you try to explain, they had to get from one place to another, and they were hell bent on linking it for some reason.
Yes,
so I
exactly
suspect right. I suspect Archeon, mounted his horse and just fucked everyone up.
I mean, that's the in one sentence version of what happened, essentially. There's a number of steps between getting on his horse.
Oh no, I imagine.
Yes, you're essentially
so.
right.
I imagine so. I mean, you probably killed all of Kislev. Wouldn't surprise me. He probably ended up killing all of the Empire. Now I know, and you'll have to explain this to me, because what the actual fuck? Obviously, Sigmar comes back.
Yep.
Uh, famous sort of weird scout leader who just does shit that he has no right to be able to do. But he somehow comes back. I think it involved Karl Franz dying, which frankly good riddance because he was useless. So a bunch of men died. Bretonia probably fell because the peasants revolted and whatnot, and frankly, who cares? Orcs are always a weird one. I imagine they just got stuck in. We're really excited. There was many fights going on. I know that Grimgor becomes a wind of magic somehow. Is also the best, and I think bitch slaps Archeon at one point. I can't quite recall, but something of that nature rings a bell. But anyway, so it's in the old world. A whole bunch of shit just happens because Archeon's there, and he's like, I've had enough of you all. Then I suspect what else happens is we need to wrap up the High Elves, Dark Elves saga. The Sundering, we've talked about it, as you said. I don't quite know how they get to this stage, but somehow the Phoenix King is assassinated, or maybe not assassinated. It's not entirely clear. Malekith becomes the Phoenix King. Yep. Tyrion is a bit of a drooling wreck at the end, and I can't quite remember why either. You can tell that I gave up on the end times because it's just garbage. Teclis is a beast still, as is the Ever Queen, Alariel. There was also something about Ariel being the Lady of the Woods, or the Lady of the Lake, rather.
Nope.
Something like that, I'm pretty sure.
You're not a million miles away, but you're also just wrong.
Yeah, that's as I said, I don't really care.
No,
the Wood Elves feature something. So what they did with Age of Sigmar, I know that all the elves are like one faction, as far as I can tell. So they clearly had an unsundering.
They reshuffled all of the elves, is what they did.
Yeah, which just spits on so much lore. But let's not get into that right now. So they wrap up the whole elf business because they obviously want to keep elves in their new battle game because everyone loves elves. So who does that leave? Oh yes, all the undead folks.
Yeah.
I imagine that hands down the best undead, Manfred, wins out, because anything else would be criminal.
That's one way of looking at what happens. It's not a correct way, but it's one way.
I'm pretty sure Nagash rocks up, because Nagash has to rock up. They've talked about Nagash throughout the lore for so much. And I really hope that he shows up and is just a bit shit.
Sadly, no.
No, I don't, because he's not in Age of Sigmar, I don't think.
He is in Age of Sigmar.
Is he? Okay.
Yeah,
I don't know Age of Sigmar that well either.
I think.
But yeah, they'll work on that, and I imagine that that's linked into the Empire storyline in some way.
Yeah.
Because why not? And then, obviously, the Lizardmen are just chilling because they have no enemies in Warhammer Fantasy Worlds, and they're just living in Lustria happily.
Yeah.
Until the moon explodes, which no one still knows why that happened, but...
very strange.
Yeah, they did all die. It's unclear how they all died and who they were fighting at the time, but, some mysteries are just not meant to be understood.
So, I mean, yeah, for someone who claims not to know much about the lore, you've sort of hit the major plot points. I mean, I'll dive into some of them in a bit, because there are some of them that are interesting and some of them that I think are actually very good. But for my money, the overall arc of the End Times actually is phenomenally good, given the aims it set out to achieve. It's this sweeping tragedy that touches every faction, turns established understandings of who and what certain characters and races are on their heads, and ultimately rings home a really important truth that for some people, winning is just more important than anything else. Manfred von Karstein, your favourite vampire, destroys the world rather than save it because he's so wrapped up in his own shit that he'd rather be dead than not in charge. Which sounds completely mad, but we've seen over the last few years in the real world that that's literally how people behave. Like, it's a phenomenal study on essentially the human condition. All of these characters wrestling to take control of their world, when they, in a world where gods, monsters, demons, what have you, are self-evidently real, and so any attempt to bring control to your own life is ultimately futile. I struggle so hard with, oh, it's bad because wow, Manfred fucked everything. When you look at his character, of course he did. That was always what he was going to do. He was always being set up as this figure who can't get past not being in charge and not winning. And I don't understand people who think that the world ending on for such petty reasons is bad. The world ends ultimately because Archaon, the sort of master of the end times, Lord of Destruction, King of Chaos type character, is just really doesn't like gods. And so the best way he can think of to get rid of them is to destroy their sources of power, that is humans, or all the sentient races, so that the gods can stop meddling in mortal affairs. I mean, he fails, but because Age of Sigmar and Archaon's in it. But it's such a human reaction to the world. You've got other things, the return of Nagash you've spoken about. You mentioned that there, but this is Manfred again working to bring back this supreme being, even though he knows it's almost certainly a terrible idea, because he's hopeful that in some way he can ride Nagash's coattails to victory. Even though it's so self-evidently a stupid thing to do for him to bring Nagash back. And ultimately, there's an argument to be made that bringing Nagash back is part of the reason why the world fails. But, all of the steps to the destruction of the world are taken by people trying to save it. And I think that's all really important. I mean, another thing that you've mentioned that it gets held up as, wow, the end times is terrible, is the conflict between the elves. And this is actually really quite well explored. So you have an entire book in the end times series dedicated to it, to the conflict between the dark elves under Malekith and the high elves under, it's sort of unclear. But you're absolutely right. So at the outset so the elves have their own end times mythos, the so-called Randadadra, I believe, where the gods become vested in mortal souls and reenact their almost creation myth, but with a destruction myth bent to it. And so you've got these paragons of the elvish culture, Imric, Lord of Dragons, Teclis, Lore Master, Tyrion, the Dragon of Cathik, all of these people who throughout, the various iterations of Warhammer Fantasy Battles have been these upstanding paragons of all that it means to be a high elf. And then, for better or worse, they all just shit the bed, and it's really funny. But not only is it really funny, I mean, Tyrion goes completely off the wall because it turns out that Tyrion's actually just like a servant to his baser instincts, which is quite funny. Teclis is the epitome of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He sets in place a chain of events that damns creation in an attempt to save his brother's soul, which is a perfectly understandable emotion. And Imric it's hard to explain what Imric does. Imric buys in with Malekith, his sworn enemy, because he's just fed up of Tyrion's shit, but at the same time comes to realize that actually the conflict with Malekith is the wrong fight. The conflict with Malekith is harming the elves' ability to wage war and defend reality in favor of some petty squabble over a throne that only Malekith can even remember. And sure, yes, you can look at, Malekith ends up the Phoenix King and think that that's ridiculous, but actually, the sacrifices that a load of people make to get Malekith there, sacrifices that Teclis makes, that Imric makes, the sacrifices that Tyrion ends up making to prevent Malekith from getting there are so impactful and so meaningful. Teclis puts Malekith on the throne knowing that there's a good chance that Malekith will kill his brother. No, he has a contingency plan, which, as I said, ends up damning reality. But at the same time, he's wrestling with what he knows he has to do, because the gods are real and the gods told him what he had to do, in order to take every step along this very, very delicate path to salvation. And ultimately, it all falls apart because Manfred von Karstein's an asshole and can't accept playing second fiddle to anyone. And I don't see why people look at the end times and pick out specific elements of it and say, "Oh, that's bad, thus bad." Like, it has to be taken as a whole. You have to look at it as an event, as a whole overarching structure. And when you look at it in that light, I'm sorry, I just think it's really good. This isn't me doing a bit. This isn't, tongue in cheek. Aragorn has no claim. I genuinely think it's good. I think the writing leaves a lot to be. The actual pen to paper writing leaves a lot to be desired. But hey, it's Black Library. If these guys were like world class authors, most of their published works wouldn't be through a game studio's in-house publisher. Right? I think Dan Abnett's a great author, right? I think he's really good. But he's not writing for Penguin or Tor. He's writing for a publishing house that exists to promote Games Workshop's products. That's all that Black Library is. Sorry. And it worked. I'm sorry. The End Times worked. Age of Sigmar worked. If you look at Games Workshop's accounts and share price today, Age of Sigmar, the spiritual successor to Warhammer Fantasy Battles, is going strong. It's just announced its 3rd edition. And at close of business on the London Stock Exchange today, Games Workshop's shares were trading at 12,240 pence. That's up 2,000% in the last 5 years. Those are GameStop numbers. Except that's based on sustained revenue and profit growth. The most recent revenue numbers for Games Workshop, which were for last year, have them at £269 million, which is an impressive jump in the last 5 years, more than doubling their revenue, which is not to be sniffed at. But the really remarkable difference is in their profit number, and that's what's translating into their share price growth. They've gone from an operating profit of about £11 million in 2014, which is not nothing, but not that great for a company of their size, to, in 2020, an operating profit of 90 million. That is insane profit growth. And I submit, a lot of that benefit is due to cutting out what can only be described as the dead wood. And that dead wood was Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Sorry. There you have it. The End Times was financially necessary. It was narratively necessary. And it was both narratively and financially a resounding success. Thank you for listening.
I doubt anyone's still here, mate. Counter-argument. The End Times was not financially necessary. The End Times was not narratively necessary, and the End Times is irrelevant in terms of financial success. I agree with you that Age of Sigmar is a resounding success.
All right.
Although some estimates that I've seen put it as maybe 30% of Games Workshop's sales. And I unfortunately don't know what Warhammer Fantasy was doing before it was cancelled. But I suspect you're right, it's probably nowhere up there.
I went digging and I found it really hard to parse their numbers because for obvious reasons they don't break it down.
So it might be wildly off. But what I do know is that 40k is the big powerhouse.
Oh,
and I think no one's going to argue with that.
It absolutely is.
And I think that's ultimately what led to the demise of fantasies. People just looked at 40k and like, this seems easier and cooler. And as you say, it's a much bigger universe. It gives us more freedom.
Yep.
And so getting Age of Sigmar makes sense. Financially, and I fully agree that companies' only loyalty is to their shareholders and making money. because that's just it. That's just how it works.
Sorry, done. There is a very technical counter argument to that, and if anyone can make it to me, I'll be really interested to hear. But yes, for our purposes, companies' only duties are to make money for their shareholders.
Yeah, I mean, if they can afford to maybe cut a little bit, make a bit of a loss to maybe satisfy people, I don't know. But you don't. The issue I'm having is you in no way need the end times to get Age of Sigmar.
Okay, no, I completely disagree. I think
it is completely necessary. No, because part of the reason for Age of Sigmar was they wanted to attract newer players, right? I'm told that Age of Sigmar was, at its core, a very easy game.
Yes,
arguably easier than 40k, because we can agree Warhammer Fantasy was not easy.
No, we can all agree that the rules for Warhammer Fantasy were bloated and complicated and unnecessary in their state that they were when it was canned. I'm actually really curious to see what they do with the old world, where they go in terms of rules, because they're going to have to hit some sort of middle ground between the old Warhammer Fantasy rules that killed Warhammer Fantasy.
See, and this, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this makes it even worse that they decided to link Age of Sigmar to Fantasy. If they wanted to attract new players, just fucking throw the lore out. New players don't care. As a matter of fact, to throw your scenario back at you, if I'm a new Age of Sigmar player and I've started collecting elves, and I'm talking about Malekith, and I go, oh, he's so cool, some neckbeard can come up to me and say, well, actually, did you know he used to be the dark elf against all these blah, 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 blah. And you can bring up all this other bullshit lore that I haven't read because I don't know Warhammer Fantasy is a thing.
Malekith's quite a bad example. I know what you're saying, but he's quite a bad example because he doesn't have a model in Age of Sigmar.
Is it Morathi does, right?
Morathi does, yeah.
I thought Malekith did as well.
No, Malekith is expected to get one in this edition, but he's melded with a dragon and become Malerion.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Age of Sigmar just does not give a shit.
Well, yeah, so Morathi, Alariel, or Teclis, I think, do have models, right?
Morathi, Alariel, and Teclis do. They're the leaders of 3 of the 4 Elvish factions.
But my point is the same. If you picked any one of those characters thinking, oh, this is a cool model, whatever, you can run into that scenario where someone goes, oh, did you know they used to be part of this other game, and they're like a fucking idiot. If you're a new player, the fact that it's linked to fantasy is in no way beneficial.
So I think the reason that it needed to be linked to fantasy is you needed that core of Warhammer Fantasy Battles players who it's not even players, it's people who like the models, who want the new models. And I think that link to fantasy is necessary. You definitely can't keep fantasy and Age of Sigmar going at the same time.
No, but that's a terrible argument, because the Age of Sigmar models, if you're a fan of, well, maybe this is my own bias talking, but then I'm always right.
If you're a fan of the owl.
No, but that's the thing. If you liked a particular model in fantasy or a particular character, it is so bastardized come Age of Sigmar. Not necessarily in a bad way, but they are fundamentally very different.
They are.
Like Alariel is a very striking example. It was actually impossible to get an Alariel model, more or less, towards the end. And she's just, a model on a square base. Quite mundane.
Yeah, she's quite mundane.
In Age of Sigmar, she's riding some sort of wood crab thing. It's
a beetle, isn't it? But
a beetle. That makes more sense.
Teclis is the same. If you think of the Teclis model for Warhammer Fantasy Battles, it was just a metal blister pack that had a single Teclis model in metal on a square base. And the new one is insane and has a sphinx for reasons, and Teclis flies, and I don't really understand it.
And this is the thing where I just don't agree with you that you needed the end times to facilitate Age of Sigmar being.
I think you did. I think you needed a reason to port these characters in, because there are too many people who.
No, but that's even more a slap in the face, right? It's one of the major arguments.
It's not. I'm not going to let you
shut up and let me talk.
Okay.
We've not said that in a while. Actually, this is good. Some of the arguments that I've seen, and I kind of understand this, right? Warhammer Fantasy, as you've said yourself, was horrendously expensive, right? Yeah. And so here you had the situation where people could have spent thousands of pounds potentially, had their armies really thematic, had Karl Franz there in their army as the leader, or invested, and all of a sudden, he gets killed, and there you are, your entire army's fucking useless. Your character, you had a story arc, is just dead. and is therefore essentially irrelevant if you care about the narrative, which that's a whole separate argument, which I'm sure we'll have. And so you'll feel really hard done by. And then you look over at someone who had Morathi, and you're like, well, they get to keep their model. What the fuck? So it alienates parts of of people who collected fantasy, and that's not healthy, I don't think.
No, I will concede to a degree that the fact that they didn't port everyone over was a problem. I think it's really important to reinforce that Games Workshop did not come into your house after they released The Fall of Altdorf and smash your Karl Franz model with a hammer.
If they did, I would have actually rated that.
That would have been really funny if they had.
Or given you a free Sigmar upgrade.
They just didn't. You still have that model. You still have those rule books. You can still get together with your buddies and play a 6-hour game of Warhammer Fantasy Battles where fucking nothing happens because it's a shit system.
Oh, yeah.
But they recognized that, as I said right at the start, a change needed to happen. Warhammer Fantasy Battles was just dying, and I think that there's a real. I think it's slightly disingenuous to say, "Oh, if you collected Karl Franz, you'd have been really cut up. If you had an Empire army led by Karl Franz, you'd be really cut up if you read the book that Karl Franz dies in, because everyone eventually read a book that their favorite character died in, because they all fucking died. And some of them got ported forward into Age of Sigmar, but not that many. We still don't have a Tyrion model. We don't have an Imric model. We don't actually have an Eltharion model. We've got no dwarf models that have continuity from like Thorgrim, except for Gottrak. You've got an Archaon model that's completely indistinguishable completely different from the Archaon model. The opposite of indistinguishable. But we've got new and exciting models. We've got weird, like, tree cow people that are excellent. You've got a Morathi model that is miles away from the Morathi model that we had previously. You don't have a Malekith model yet, even though there was a Malekith model in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. They've created all of this new lore, but they needed that continuity back to Warhammer Fantasy Battles so they could say to these people whose Warhammer Fantasy they were stopping so they could say to them, don't worry, we're still making a fantasy game and it's still going to have all these characters in it that you love. You want Sigmar? Fine. Sigmar's here. Sigmar's great. You want Alarielle because reasons? Look, she's here. And now she's got a proper model that you can buy, and it's plastic and it's easy to put together. And also she's riding a beetle because we've just gone completely balls to the wall insane. And I don't
think you need that.
You there. You need an event to get you there.
No, you don't. You don't, because you could have just. And this is where I would argue that Games Workshop were phenomenally lazy. Right? They knew what they wanted.
Yeah,
which was Space Marines Light, and so they made the Stormcast Eternals. Because let's not kid ourselves. Age of Sigmar is literally just we have made a new Space Marine line that you can all fawn over and buy.
No, that's not actually.
And they're literally also the ones that are now in this video game. They're the front runners. They're the poster boys. Much like the Space Marines are in 40k, you have the Stormcast Eternals who are just Space Marines.
So,
look at them.
No, let me speak. Yes, the Stormcast Eternals are the poster boys for Age of Sigmar. That's fine. I'll concede that. I don't think that really needs to be conceded. That's just a provable fact. They've got, I think, twice as many models as anything else, which makes them occupy a similar design space to Space Marines. However, there is a really important barriers to entry reason for that. And that is that they are so easy to paint. You compare that to Warhammer Fantasy Battles, there was no equivalent easy to paint faction. And that's what Space Marines really have going for them, is that your basic Space Marine is just big bits of flat that you can slap paint on and it doesn't look awful. That's why the Imperial Guard aren't the posters for Warhammer 40k. It's because the little cloth trousers and shit that they're wearing is really actually very hard to paint if you're picking up your first models.
Yeah,
That's
well,
why
also you
you
need 5 guard to have one marine model. It costs way more money.
No, there's all sorts of other reasons why the guard are why Space Marines are Space Marines. But like you just need an equivalent faction.
No, I know, and I get that. I fully agree that it's an entry level model for
It's
an entry level game.
Point of entry, yeah.
Yeah, but that doesn't detract from the fact that they are just Space Marines, and maybe this is some sort of ploy to actually concede ultimately that I was right and that Warhammer Fantasy is in fact the same universe as 40k and Age of Sigmar is the time in between. When that happens, I will send you a postcard very gleefully.
Cool.
No, but I maintain that you simply did not need to go from, as in, what I'm actually really saying is you did not need to end the Warhammer Fantasy narrative. They could have just said, almost a bit like when you get major software updates, he's like, we're just no longer supporting this. Nothing new will come out. Instead, what we have here is Age of Sigmar, which is different. It's cool. It's fresh. It's easy to play. There's some similar characters and whatnot, but their backstory doesn't really matter all that much in terms of what happened to them in fantasy. That would have, to me, just been easier. And I think that they tried to come up with this botched attempt to excuse the fact that they are stopping Warhammer by finishing off the narrative, and they just did it poorly. They did it really, really poorly.
I'm not sure that I agree that you can essentially leave the fans of Warhammer Fantasy hanging, saying, oh yeah, we're not supporting this anymore, but we're also not giving you a conclusion to any of those stories.
Well, you can tell the gamers to make up their own conclusions.
Yeah, but gamers are idiots.
Fanfic going.
Oh no,
we'll have a 50 Shades of Grey from.
That's the fanfic, isn't it?
Yeah, that is the fanfic, isn't it?
Yeah. No, don't do that. No, fans are awful. They don't know what they want. Okay,
I'm just saying because the other real issue I have with the end times, as you said, some of the things that I've seen of it, like, okay, that's pretty cool, and some of the characters they have interesting arcs, but you don't need to bring Nagash back. Frankly,
I think
it's unnecessary. No, you only bring him back because you're Age of Sigmar. Nagash will be there.
I think you bring him back.
Nagash. You don't need to do that. But you also the end times just feels rushed overall, right? So either, and this is probably from a business perspective, they needed to just stop it and move on. And I think they would have been just better served to say, we are no longer supporting Warhammer. Here's Age of Sigmar. Go nuts, as opposed to doing this fucking calamity that is the end times.
So I will give you that it feels rushed. The pacing, particularly in the last book, Lord of the End Times, is really weird. I will grant you that, but I think it was a necessary business decision to put something out, but.
Don't you also get like
you do
the Game of Thrones effect where Karl Franz sort of ping pongs all over the continent?
There's all sorts of that. People move. There's
so fast.
weird time dilation goes on. I'm fairly sure people travel from Athel Loren to Middenheim in time that doesn't really work, but then it takes them like 3 days to get across Middenheim. It's really confusing. But to your specific example, I think if you're having a world-ending level event, you do need people like Nagash to put in appearances. You'd have a real... If you did the whole Incarnates storyline, so this is the idea that Teclis, because he's insane, unshackles all of the winds of magic from the vortex and instead tries to bind them in living or like souls, essentially. So like Tyrion eventually ends up as the living incarnation of the magic wind of light, and Malekith ends up as the living incarnation of the magic wind of shadow, And Nagash ends up as the undead incarnation of the Wind of Death. And there's no way that you can have that storyline and have the Wind of Death end up in anyone other than Nagash, because the immediate response would always be, yeah, but it should just be Nagash. From all of the people who complain about about the end times, they would complain that it wasn't Nagash. He's
Sure.
just too big a presence across the whole lore.
Sure. But okay, fine. Let's agree. I mean, we're kind of disagreeing here, but let's for argument's sake agree that you need someone like Nagash, right? And you do want to draw a line on the Warhammer Fantasy. Why then does a business as sensible, apparently, as you've made them look, as sensible as Games Workshop, not say, well, there is a very lucrative way in which we can end Warhammer Fantasy? Now, I will admit, I say that not knowing how lucrative Black Library books are, but I imagine it's not very. I don't know if you happen to have a number.
I have no.
I've got no concept.
Some of them are New York Times bestsellers, but not many.
Okay, so that's pretty decent.
Yeah.
But my argument for would be if they had just been a little bit patient, right? If they had waited 2 years, they could have started the ultimate story arc, the end of the Warhammer story arc, by teaming up, as they did anyway, with Creative Assembly and producing Total War Warhammer, right?
The short answer is,
I think Total War Warhammer has made something like 30 plus million. That's probably per game. That may be Warhammer 2, which is obviously more popular, but that's loads of money.
That sounds not a million miles away. The short answer is,
and they could have let players play campaigns there and just finish off the universe and had a grand campaign story arc there and not bother with this shit that is End Times.
there's a number of answers to that. The first is that Total War Warhammer was a massive gamble.
What, an End Times wasn't?
End Times wasn't, because the decision had already been made. They were
but that then almost proves me right, which I love to hear, and I'm claiming that is that they rushed the End Times just so they can fucking finish and move on, which they didn't. They just didn't need to do that. I see no reason for them to have done that. But anyway, back to your Total War argument.
I'm now trying to remember what my Total War argument was. We need to stop interrupting each other.
No, never.
It's really bad.
The problem is there is slight delay.
Yeah, what was my point? My point was, so firstly, Total War Warhammer was a massive gamble, albeit so was the End Times. Secondly, you would have had a problem with people saying, why the fuck do I need to buy a video game that I don't want to play in order to have a culmination of my story? Right? Because you're always going to have people complain. And this idea, all 5 End Times books will cost you probably less, well, definitely less than all of Total War Warhammer and Total War Warhammer 2.
Oh, you think?
Yes. I mean, all of the 2 Warhammers will cost you well over 100 quid.
With all the DLCs, yeah, I suppose you're not
with all the DLC. Well, even just the 2 games is 80 quid or whatever it is. And it's a trilogy. So I don't think that you would have had a satisfactory video game tie-in in the same way that you just write, because you've then got the problem, right? So if you tie it to a video game, what do you do when the player plays as the Empire and wins? And you've been like, well, because as you know, in Total War Warhammer, the world ended, so now we have Age of Sigmar, and that guy who was playing a Carl Franz game is like, well, I saved the world, so can I buy more halberdiers, please?
That's a fair argument, and that's for people who are more creative than I to solve.
Because the alternative to that, of course, is
holy shit! Wow.
The alternative to that, of course, is to have the game itself be on rails, such that the world ends no matter what you do. But that's not going to be a satisfying gameplay experience. So,
yeah, no, that's true. And I'm not saying that I have the game in mind as to how you do it, but I'm just saying that if it was a pure monetary decision, then they should have looked into that as opposed to going to the Black Library. It's such a cop-out.
it is, but it's also it's how they do things, right? Because they it's how they're doing the Horus Heresy. It's how they did the return of Gilliman in 40k. It's how they do any of their big lore changes. They do it through the Black Library.
Yeah, the Horus Heresy is an interesting example, right? Because I guess they're being written based on what we already have, if that makes sense.
That's true, but they're
Right,
also
Horus is
tweaking.
dead, so
They're also
sorry.
tweaking the lore. They keep making little changes
True.
here and there.
No, that is true.
But you're right. They're staying broadly within the tram lines.
Yeah, they're not just going to bring Horus back and be like, surprise!
No, they're not. They're not. They're not.
They
they're
might
not.
actually do that. I wouldn't put anything past the Black
That
Library.
would be very funny.
Whoa,
shit!
Let me just looking through my notes to see if there's anything else that I had. No, I mean I do look forward to finishing off all the books because it does sound, as you say, that, but this is true of all Black Library, right? Some books are really good, and then others are like, "What the fuck was that?"
I think that Curse of Cain, so the elf one, is one of the better written ones. I think that Return of Nagash is weirdly funny because Manfred von Karstein is such a cackling nutter in it, and so obviously like just sick in the head. And Lord of the End Times is good because you've got all these various characters who don't normally interacting. Like there's an excellent, I must have spoken about this before, there's an excellent interaction between Sigmar and Nagash, which you do get a little bit in Sigmar's origin story books, but not this, like, it's just like a one-line thing. Sigmar does somehow like beats the shit out of a bloodthirster, which is really funny. And then Nagash is there and rips the head off the bloodthirster, and Sigmar just nods at Nagash and goes, "Monster," and then walks off. And it's just such a, like, that was a bit rude, but it's also really, really funny. And Lord of the End Times has Vlad von Karstein in it, who's just excellent, and I love him. The best von Karstein. So I think
he actually is. Manfred is an absolute pansy. Yeah.
I think the very last point that I would want to make is that this is in no way a defense of the first edition of Age of Sigmar, and I think that's quite an important distinction.
I'm glad you said it.
Quite an important distinction to make. I mean, I think that in its current guise, it looks like Age of Sigmar is a really, really good game. It's got better balance. It has something approaching balance for a start, which is always to be looked for in a tabletop wargame. But I just give you a sense of what the first edition of Age of Sigmar rules included. So one of the characters that you could play as was a chap called Kurt Hellborg. And Kurt Hellborg had a rule which read, "Pride of the Reichsguard. Hellborg's skill is as legendary as his moustache is magnificent. You can re-roll any failed hit rolls when attacking with the Runefang, which is Kurt Hellborg's sword, as long as you have a bigger and more impressive mustache than your opponent."
What?
Yep.
Well then,
there were rules that gave you bonuses if you actually gave a war cry when charging. There were rules that penalized you for wearing jeans. Like, the game, first edition of Age of Sigmar, as far as I can make out, was a mess. But
that sounds incredible. Although mustache is perhaps a slightly difficult one. Although I guess, yeah.
Nothing requires... Yeah, I was going to say, nothing in that rule requires you to have grown that mustache yourself.
Yeah, I could say, so you could totally cosplay your character.
Yeah.
See, but even that little statement there, you know, Reichsguard, Runefang.
Yeah, I want to look into that, because those are just
Warhammer Fantasy terms.
Warhammer Fantasy terms.
You know, I don't know. This is the thing I have with Age of Sigmar, because I look at the rules and I look, you know, they look interesting, and the reviews I've read of the current version are pretty good.
Yeah. It's entirely free to access the rules as well. All the rules are freely available, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
Because you still need to pay hundreds upon hundreds of pounds for the plastic crack to play it, so it doesn't really matter if the rules are free.
Yeah, although I think it is cheaper to essentially get to grips with Age of Sigmar than it is anything else, right?
I think it is, yeah.
But barring maybe Lord of the Rings, I don't know.
I don't know.
Like 4 models there to get going.
I don't know.
So yeah, I think we can maybe agree that Age of Sigmar. We certainly can't. I can't argue with you about the numbers.
Bringing out some actual numbers was maybe cheating.
Well, no, because I was really hoping to find some sort of stat that originally said that 50% of sales were for Warhammer Fantasy, and now 30% are Age of Sigmar, which then I could have spun maybe as a worsening. Well, it's probably actually just a strengthening of 40k. But I couldn't find any of those numbers, so
that's the thing.
I mean, 40k is going really strong. I think that's the real weirdness of this. I don't know what happened. I don't know if people jumped over to 40k, if 40k just got a lot better.
I think 40k got better.
If you're not an Eldar fan,
as long as you like Space Marines, I think 40k got better. I think that's what happened there. It had apparently some really weird, like 6th or 7th edition. The rules were really barmy, and that put a load of people off. But it's stabilized, and they're upping all of the power levels as well, which is always popular. Bringing back Gilliman, giving the Necrons people like the Silent King, just making models for Magnus and Mortarion, so you can just buy them off the shelf, and then you've got Primarchs that you can play with. I think all of that is really helping it. They're just not looking at the Eldar, the Imperial Guard, really. No, they're getting no love.
Yeah, and this is the problem with increasing the power on the game, right? Because now, I mean, what are your Eldar going to do against the Primaris Space Marine army? Just nothing.
Well, exactly.
You're just hopelessly lost. But the game is in flux, so it's not. As with all these things, you're not going to create a perfect thing overnight. So
yeah, absolutely.
So the tempers have calmed down. I mean, fundamentally, I still disagree with you that I think the End Times was necessary.
Fair enough.
But that is not to say that I don't agree with you that Age of Sigmar is a success and Games Workshop did the right thing.
Those are potentially two different questions, and I conflated them because I could answer one of them, and so I pretended that one was the other. Sophistry, it wins.
Exactly. That reminds me, I think you do owe our listeners a definition of a grognardism.
No, I don't actually.
I think you do.
I think they can come up with what they think I meant and then yell at me for it.
Right? You know what to do, listeners. Go to the comments. Just tweet at Sean.
Yeah, grognardism is... you see it quite frequently in Dungeons and Dragons. It's an assertion that the older editions of something are better, and the newer editions of something, this is how I'm using it, the newer editions of something cannot possibly be as good as the old editions, and anyone who likes the new editions is stupid because they don't like the old editions.
Yeah, that's pretty well put, I think.
Yeah, that's how I'm using that definition. If you understand it to mean something different, then fine.
That's pretty well put. No, and then I think a final question for you. You did briefly mention that they are bringing Old World back.
I did mention Old World.
They're introducing Old World, so bringing back fantasy. Do you think they'll get it right?
Do I think they'll get Old World right? I think it's going to live and die by the complexity of its rules. Because I think they're now in a position where they'll be able to make the miniatures better. Because this is the other one. The old Warhammer Fantasy miniatures were just not great.
Awful.
A lot of them. Particularly the metal ones. But so the miniatures should be good. I'm expecting the miniatures to be good. They've obviously picked a time period that they have a lot of potential lore for. Like, there's a lot written about it, so there'll be a lot they'll be able to do in the lore space. But it'll live and die by its rule set. And I'm hopeful that they find a way to make people who want square bases happy without taking away from some of the streamlining that has made both 40k and Age of Sigmar better than Fantasy Battles was. There is a way to get back some of the complexity that people say they want without damaging a lot of the gains that they've made. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah. Do we know much about it? Is it? I'm assuming it's set obviously before the end times, but in a particular time period, right?
It's set during the time of the three empires, I think.
Yeah. So it's quite clever. So they can bring back a lot of the fan favorites. Without compromising Age of Sigmar lore as well. So
yeah, that's exactly right. So you won't get Karl Franz, for example. You won't get Louon Leoncoeur. You probably won't get the twins. You might get the twins actually, Tyrion and Teclis, because I can never quite work out when the time of the three emperors was. But you'll get people who occupy those spaces. You'll get Malekith, definitely. You'll definitely get Marathi. You might well get Thorgrim, absolutely, or you'll get a dwarf high king. You'll get a elvish fighter. You'll get an elvish mage. You'll get a Bretonnian knightly king. You'll get 3 different emperors from the empire who each exemplify slightly different traits of the empire. So I think from that perspective, they've got quite a lot that they can do. I'm just, I fear that they'll fly too much back to the people who complain about Age of Sigmar, and miss the fact that Age of Sigmar, the people who like Age of Sigmar massively outnumber the people who complain about Age of Sigmar on Reddit.
Yeah,
is my answer.
Yeah, I think that is fair.
Yeah,
I think it's a very niche market, so maybe the marketing boffins over at Games Workshop can figure out how to make that lucrative. Maybe this is where the 3D printing arena comes in handy.
Maybe. I think they're marketing to a really specific segment of their audience, and they know that as well, so they can maybe afford to be a little bit riskier there. But that's a topic for another time once it launches. I think all that remains to us is to say thank you for listening to this episode of Expertise is Overrated. No doubt, we've said some things that were either objectively wrong or downright offensive. As ever, feel free to let us know. Rate the podcast and leave us a comment or drop us an email at expertiseisoverrated@gmail.com. Tweet us at @zeroexpertise. Check out our website, expertiseisoverrated.podbean.com, or come join us on our Discord server.
If you're lucky, we might just argue with you in one of our upcoming episodes, and if you're really lucky, we might call you an idiot. Now, in our next episode, we're retreating rapidly to more familiar territory, asking, in the Dresden Files, what's the worst kind of vampire? White, red, or black? Join us then for more nonsense.